Well, hello, my new friends. Welcome back to Second Chance on Love Side B. So, we are almost ready to wrap up season one. Wow, already. And if you're wondering why it's called Side B, well, if you grew up in the 80s, you already know. Side A was good, but Side B, that was where the best songs lived. The ones you played over and over again, the ones that meant something and you didn't skip over them. And the more I think about it, that's exactly what this season has felt like. Side B, the part of the story that comes later, but somehow ends up meaning even more than the beginning. So lately, I've had these moments where I just have to stop and pinch myself because this podcast, this book, and I'm officially a published author. The people we've met, the stories we've shared and heard, none of it existed a few years ago. And yet here we are talking about second chances. Honestly, I never would have thought that I would have ever written a romance novel. Are you even kidding me? I am a true crime mystery lover, dateline kind of girl. But here we are. Okay, so back to the season. We have been talking about love, faith, and discovering something that every guest this season seemed to come back to, that God is the ultimate matchmaker. He knows our hearts, He knows our intentions, and sometimes when the timing is right, He brings people back together. So today I want to reflect on the stories we heard this season and share the heart behind the book. And speaking of the book, I want to share where the title for our book originated, As Sure as the Stars, because it's not just a pretty phrase. It actually comes from a song that meant something to us even before we understood why. So back in 1989, there was a song by Taylor Dane, I love her, called Love Will Lead You Back. And there's a line in that song that stopped us in our tracks or mid type when we heard it again years later. I'm sure as stars are shining, one day you will find me again. When we were working through the story with our script writers, that line just kept coming back to us because somehow it felt like it had been quietly telling our story all along. What's almost unbelievable, the song was released in 1989, the very same time Brian and I were supposed to reconnect, but didn't because of, as I call it, technology of the 1900s, a disconnected phone. And when you think about that, it's almost hard to ignore. A song about love finding its way back. The lyrics are just so fitting to the story, playing it at the exact moment that our story was paused. And years later, when everything finally came full circle, that lyric felt less like a coincidence and more like a God wink or a promise that love, real love, doesn't disappear. It just waits. It does find its way back. And that's why the title felt so right. But not only that, I need to mention the scene, the northern lights and the starry nights of Alaska in the wintertime. They literally look and feel so close, like you could touch them, like you could feel them. And the North Star is also portrayed in our logo, guiding us back home. So, over and over again this season, our guests shared something very interesting. They believed their story was over. Years had passed, sometimes decades. They had built entire lives apart. And yet somehow their paths crossed again. And when they looked back, they realized something, that God had been quietly working behind the scenes the whole time. Because sometimes some things don't make sense until much, much later. But when they do, you'll see that it was always love. So that line sits right at the heart of our book. Trisha and I wrote As Sure as the Stars because we believe something deeply. And a side note, Brian, by the way, brought us all together. He started this whole project rolling and it just keeps growing. So miracles happen and they're meant to be shared. In a world that feels chaotic and uncertain, we wanted to share and tell a real, true love story, one that reminds people that hope is still alive. Sometimes miracles look like reconnections, they look like forgiveness, and sometimes they look like realizing that love that you thought was gone or was over actually never left. Because the truth is, what I really wanted, what Jennie really wanted, wasn't fireworks or a movie scene kind of love. I wanted the quiet kind of love, the Tuesday morning kind. And honestly, after everything Brian and I have been through, that line from the book means even more to me now because the quiet kind of love, that's the kind that lasts. But let me take you back for a moment, one last time, back to Alaska in the 1980s. At the time, I felt like my life had taken a strange turn. A quote from the book says, "My life was over. Since I had been cast to the far edge of the world, the place where the local store sold Carhartt jackets instead of Vogue." Yes, that's Alaska for you. Cold, remote, and very far from everything that was very familiar to me. I had just moved to Alaska, 14 years old, 1984, which felt like a little bit of being dropped off at the edge of the world. I was a teen girl who loved MTV, mall food courts, and John Hughes movies. So people talked about moose sightings like they were weather reports, plugged their cars in with extension cords, and the sun had two settings, never rising, never going down. I stayed in Alaska till about 1988 ish, senior year of high school. And even after leaving for college, I kept coming back to visit. Because once Alaska gets into your story, it never really leaves. But sometimes the place that you think is exile is actually where your story is beginning. So maybe this frozen edge of the world was an exile. Maybe this was just the beginning. And then there was him, Brian, teenage Brian. We met at a high school dance. To this day, I remember that dance and how he looked down at me with those ridiculously gorgeous brown eyes, the kind that could have landed him on a Teen Beat poster without even trying. And in that moment, everything changed. One heartbeat, one boy I suddenly couldn't look away from, and one moment that hummed with possibility. But life doesn't always follow the script we expect. Sometimes the timing isn't right. Misunderstandings happen and distance gets in the way. And like I said, technology from the 1900s fells you every time. And if you're laughing right now, you know exactly what I mean. Back then, we didn't have texting, we didn't have social media, we had landlines, answering machines, and broken payphones, which means sometimes a missed call changes everything because sometimes love stories pause and sometimes they disappear into silence. Years passed, decades passed. I worked in the fashion industry, then went into the legal field. And yes, I have my own legally blonde story. I dealt with divorces as well as my own. There were moments when I started to question how these love stories even end. Moments when I found myself thinking they end in a divorce file. That thought stayed with me because life had happened. Relationships had come and gone. I'd been hurt. And somewhere along the way, I started to believe that maybe that kind of love just wasn't in the cards for me anymore. There were even moments when I caught myself thinking, just wondering when men got out of the knight in shining armor business. And I laugh about that now. But back then, that felt so real. I had quietly started to close that chapter in my heart, just little by little, convincing myself that I was done with that kind of love, that maybe that love I once believed in was something that didn't really exist. It was just my imagination. And what I didn't know in that moment was that right when I had started to let go of that idea, God was already preparing to bring it back. And not just any love, it was that love. That one that had never really left, the one that had been waiting all along. Then out of nowhere, life shifted, but in a quiet, serendipitous way that felt too meaningful to be random, just quietly, unexpectedly, like a door I thought had been closed for good, slowly opening again. And there he was, Brian. Not a memory, not what if or where did you go? Not a chapter I had tucked away and convinced myself was over. Real, standing right in front of me again. And in that moment, everything felt strangely familiar and completely new at the same time. Something deep inside me recognized him before my mind could catch up. Like time itself had done something I couldn't explain. It folded in on itself, past and present crashing together, making it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. 30 years of silence just evaporated. All of a sudden, we weren't two people with decades between us. We were just two people standing face to face again with a few more gray hairs and a few laugh lines between us. And the way he said my name, Jennie, it was certain. It honestly shook something loose in me that I had never felt before, something I didn't even realize was still there. Like he saw me, he recognized me, he knew me. And I remember thinking, this isn't random. This doesn't feel like a coincidence. This feels like something that God has been writing all along. Life has a funny way of circling back, and sometimes God isn't finished with the story, even when we think we are. And just like that, the story I thought had ended wasn't over at all. It had just been waiting all those years for the right moment to begin again. And also in that moment, I realized some loves don't disappear, they wait. One of my favorite parts of hosting this podcast has been listening to the incredible stories our guests have shared. And what struck me most was how different each story was on the surface: different states, different decades, different circumstances. But underneath it all, they shared something in common. So I like to think of this part of the show as the lost and found section because every story this season started the same way, with a love that once felt certain, somehow becoming lost, and then years later, miraculously being found again. Take Debbie and Jerry, for example. Their story started in the 1980s in Alaska. Teenage love, passing notes, church feels innocent and electric at the same time. But like so many stories back then, life intervened, distance happened, communication faded, and eventually they lost touch. Yet the feeling never completely disappeared. Years later, after life had taken them both down very different paths, their story found its way back. And what struck me most about Debbie's reflection was this truth that some loves may go quiet, but they never truly leave your heart. Then there was Doris and Munch. Their story began with something almost cinematic: a simple phone call, one voice, one moment of curiosity, and suddenly two lives intersected. But again, life moved forward, different directions, different chapters. Again, decades passed until one unexpected message changed everything. And suddenly their story, which had been paused for more than 30 years, started writing its next chapter. And that's what fascinated me as I listened to these stories, because every couple described something very similar: a first love that felt different, a connection that stayed in the back of their mind for years, and then at the exact moment life shifted, their paths crossed again. Not by accident, but almost as if something bigger, something divine had been guiding the timing all along. And that's the thread that wove through every conversation this season. These weren't just love stories, they were lost and found stories. Stories about timing, growth, forgiveness, faith, and the realization that sometimes the love we thought we lost was simply waiting for the right moment to return. And I think that's why these stories resonate so deeply with everyone, because somewhere inside, many of us wonder the same thing. So, what if the person who meant the most is still part of the story? What if love doesn't expire? It just evolves. And what if sometimes love really does take the long way around? This lost and found of season one reminded me of something I believe deeply now. Sometimes love disappears, sometimes it hides behind time and distance, but sometimes when the timing is finally right, God brings it back. And that realization, that thread connecting every story we heard, led me to a deeper question: what is it about love that allows it to survive for years, sometimes decades apart? And the answer might be simpler than we think, because sometimes love is stronger than time, and sometimes it was always meant to find its way home. One of the most powerful things I've learned that second chances rarely happen quickly. They happen after growth and life storms, after life shapes you. As one moment in the book says, the storms of life had battered each of us, yet they also had shaped us into the people we are today. And through it all, God had been guiding the story. God's our North Star. He led us here to now. There's a scene in the book I absolutely love because it captures the heart of the entire story. It's written as a teacher giving me advice about my special person, but in real life, it was even more personal than that. It was a church leader standing outside the Palmer Church in the parking lot, the same parking lot, ironically enough, where Brian and I shared our first teenage kiss, giving me some advice for my future self. He looked down at me and he simply said to me, and he added something that stayed with me all these years: when the timing is right, you will know him. You will know him. Once again, when the timing is right, you will know him. You will know. And when we found our way back to each other, I remembered that moment in time and I knew what he was talking about because at the time, 16-year-old little me, I didn't fully understand what he was talking about. But now, looking back, that moment feels like a quiet truth planted in my heart long before I was ready to understand it. Because that one moment captures the thread that ran through every single story we heard this season. That when something is real, when it's meant to be, when the timing finally aligns, love has a way of finding its way back. That moment captures the truth behind every story we heard this season. Because sometimes love is stronger than fear. Sometimes answered prayers are not quick fixes. And sometimes the story that seemed finished is simply waiting for the right chapter to begin again. I keep coming back to this thought. Love isn't always loud. It isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, growing roots before it blooms. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was something simpler, sweeter, the steady kind of beginning. And sometimes, the world dissolves into black, but love, as sure as the stars, as certain as breath, sings on. Because sometimes love takes the long way around. And sometimes the people we love most need time to find their way back. So I have to share one more fun thing with you, because if you grew up in the 80s, you know this is true. Every great story had an amazing soundtrack. I mean, every John Hughes movie, the music wasn't just in the background, it was the story. So, of course, we had to do the same thing. We created a playlist, or let's be honest, back in the 80s, we would have called it a soundtrack. So, we created a soundtrack. And this one, it's packed with over 200 songs from the 80s for a long road trip. The songs we lived, the songs we felt as teens in the 80s, with the words that we just didn't know how to say out loud. The songs that carried all those moments we didn't even realize were shaping our lives. So if you have the book or the bookmark, you can scan a QR code and step right into the soundtrack of the story. And if you don't have it handy, don't worry. We've added the link into the show notes so you can listen to it there or on our website at secondchanceonlove.com. Because every great love story deserves a great soundtrack. And this one, well, it's definitely a side B kind of playlist. And one more thing, I am becoming a gatherer, a collector of second chance love stories. And if you have a second chance love story, I would absolutely love to hear it. You can connect with me and share your story at secondchanceonlove.com because your story might be the one that gives someone else hope. And if you've enjoyed this season, please follow the podcast, leave a review, share it with someone who believes in second chances or not, because the stories we heard this season prove something beautiful. Second chances exist. Miracles happen. And sometimes love really is as sure as the stars. Thank you for being part of season 1 of Second Chance on Love Side B. I'm Jennie, and I cannot wait to see where this journey goes next.
And it's love.